Welcome. This is Julia Wahl speaking, and today I'll have the pleasure of speaking to David Loy, who's a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy, and now retired from academia. And David has been teaching extensively in various places at various universities. And if you don't mind telling us a little bit more about yourself, David, what your interests are, what you are focusing on right now.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, Julia. I'm very happy to be able to join you. Um, as you said, I'm retired professor
Hmm.
and a teacher in the Sambo Zen tradition of Japanese
Hmm.
Buddhism. Um, I'm also one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain Ecodharma
Hmm.
Retreat Center, which is in the mountains above Boulder, where I live
Hmm.
in Colorado in the USA. And in addition to teaching, I do quite a bit of writing. You mentioned the
Hmm.
most recent book, ecodharma. Uh,
Hmm.
also, uh, I guess you could say I'm especially interested in the conversation between Buddhism and modernity, and
Hmm.
especially you could say the social and ecological implications of that.
So that's actually the topics that I like to discuss with you today, if you don't mind, David. Uh, Also, in reference to your latest book, ecodharma: Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis. So we'll get into that a bit later. But let's start with the encounter between Buddhism and modernity, because I'm familiar with yet another, because there are quite a few books that you've written, yet another book called Lack and Transcendence.
Mm.
So the problem of death and life in psychotherapy, existentialism, and Buddhism, and you often reflect on the topic of Buddhism, this oral overlap. Between Buddhism and modernity. So, what can each learn from the other, David?
Well, that's such a big question,
Uh,
but the reference to the Lack and Transcendence book
mm-hmm,
narrows it down a bit, because
mm-hmm,
that book explores not only
mm-hmm,
Buddhism but
mm-hmm,
Western psychology, Western
mm-hmm,
psychotherapy, and also existentialism.
mm-hmm,
It sort of comes up with a sort of
mm-hmm,
unified field theory on the
mm-hmm,
basis of that. Uh, and the real focus of the book is an attempt to understand what Buddhism is saying
mm-hmm,
with this very strange counterintuitive teaching about no self or non-self.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So, Buddhism starts with dukkha, suffering in the
mm-hmm,
broadest sense. And ultimately, there's the claim that at the core of our dukkha, dissatisfaction,
mm-hmm,
frustration, whatever, is the delusion of a separate self.
mm-hmm,
And the basic argument of that book, which I think is important, is that in contemporary language, the sense of self that we
mm-hmm,
usually have, it's not referring to something real. It's a
mm-hmm,
psychological and social construct.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
because it is a construct, it doesn't have any sort of inherent reality of its own.
mm-hmm,
It's the way that a bunch of sort of mental and physical processes sort of
mm-hmm,
interact.
mm-hmm,
And the really important point there is that because it's not anything substantial or real,
mm-hmm,
the sense of self is inherently insecure,
mm,
inherently uncomfortable.
mm-hmm,
And we normally experience that as a sense of lack, as the feeling
mm-hmm,
that something is wrong with me, something is missing, something isn't
mm-hmm,
quite right. I'm good enough. Something that I think at one time or another,
mm-hmm.
all of us have experienced.
So we'll go back to modernity in a moment, but since we started discussing one of your previous books. So on that topic, I do have a question actually. So do we
Hmm.
need to deconstruct ourselves in order for the collective benefit? So slightly touching on the collective benefit, and the ecological crisis, maybe. So, do we need to deconstruct ourselves, for the benefit of others?
Hmm. Well, maybe I can be a little bit picky on words there and saying that,
Please do,
you
please do.
know,
Yeah.
we don't really deconstruct ourselves.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
like that's like picking up your sort of elevating yourself by pulling on your shoestrings. I mean,
Mm.
the self doesn't deconstruct itself. What happens
Mhm.
when we're doing something like meditation is
Mhm.
that by letting go of those habitual patterns, in a way,
Mhm.
the the deconstruction happens by itself. But
Mhm.
I agree. I'm being a little bit picky there.
Mhm.
The important point is, getting back to your question, is
Mhm.
that uh, when you look, say, at the Buddhist tradition, the way it's
Mhm.
evolved is that the focus has been on individual transformation of the
Mhm.
sort that we've been just talking about. And
Mhm.
then when you look and compare with the Western tradition,
Mhm.
Western civilization going back to the Greeks and the Hebrews and such, the focus has been much more on social transformation,
Mhm.
restructuring our societies, social revolutions and such. And I think the really important point there, which we can see, is how each of those projects, if you want to call them
Mhm.
that, needs the other. That
Mhm.
um, I think what we can see, and a lot of things happening in the modern
Mhm.
world sort of reinforce this, that if you simply try to sort of transform society with
Mhm.
different laws and institutions, you can never make a society, you can never make those institutions or structures, social structures, so perfect that they're going to run themselves. In other
Mhm.
words, uh, what often happens, what I think is happening, is that sort of powerful people tend to find ways to subvert them.
Mm.
In other words, um, rather than understanding the solution to the problems we face today as social transformation, I
Mhm.
think we also need to see the need for individual transformation as well. For example,
Mhm.
the way that Buddhism talks about the fundamental three poisons: greed, ill will,
Mhm.
delusion. If we don't find ways to address them in our own lives, if we're still motivated by greed and ill will and
Mm.
delusion, then the institutional changes won't work out as well as we hope.
Mm. Uh, I often think that we shouldn't overemphasize one or the other. So I
Mm,
think it's about combining the individual with the systemic or collective, or and the other way around. And I consider it to be a mistake only focusing on just the one, like the ongoing debate when it comes to mindfulness. That mindfulness
mm,
um, has been focusing too much on the individual. It's individualistic. And it's actually maintaining the status quo rather than being this revolution that it's
mm,
promised to beat. So let's go back to our initial question.
mhm.
So the encounter between Buddhism and modernity. So what can each of these approaches learn from the other, David?
Well, in a way, that would go back to what I was talking about, the need both for personal transformation and social
Okay.
transformation. I think that
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
a very important part of it. That I mean,
Mhm.
that's not the only
Mhm.
thing by any means,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
I would tend to foreground that, I think, as the most
Mhm.
important. That when we look at the Buddhist
Mhm.
tradition, um, what Buddhism has evolved over the centuries is probably the world's greatest collection of contemplative meditative practices that can help us
Mhm.
transform ourselves. And so I think
Mhm.
that's what Buddhism has to offer
Mhm.
the modern world. Whereas
Mhm.
but if you also look at, say, Buddhist societies
Mhm.
in Asia, none of
Mhm.
them was
Mhm.
democratic. And
Mhm.
so Buddhism never really developed the kind of social side
Mhm.
that we find in Europe.
Mhm.
That for the most part, Buddhist
Mhm.
leaders and teachers were careful not to challenge the state, uh,
Mhm.
but rather they wanted support and at least tolerance by the state.
Mhm.
And so this is what I think modernity has to offer there. That
Mhm.
going back to what we started with, the
Mhm.
need to work on both sides, personal as well as social transformation.
And indeed, that's often the critique or criticism of Buddhism. That
Mm,
why hasn't it worked socially that well in certain parts of Asia, if it indeed is all about its ethics
mm,
and well in using our Western words, we'd say empathy,
mhm,
or let's say compassion. So let's focus on this criticism. We were
mm,
not afraid of being critical, thinking critically. So
mm,
how do we negotiate these disparities between the emphasis on
mm,
ethics in Buddhism and, for instance, the recent scandals in the Buddhist world?
mm, mm,
Haven't we, have we idolized or romanticized Buddhists a little bit too much? And what kind of changes do we need in the West in terms of how we approach Buddhism,
mm,
Buddhist teachings, and indeed its leaders or teachers, and the whole concept of a guru?
mm,
So
mm.
because you at one point in your latest book, you say, does Buddhism itself needs to wake up? And I really like that
Mm,
question. Yeah.
well, you've touched on a lot of things there.
Yes,
Yeah,
I did. Yeah.
let me start by saying
Mhm.
um, I suspect, and it's hard to know for certain given
Mhm.
the paucity of sources here, but it seems to me the Buddha was a lot more radical than the institution that developed after he died, right?
Mm.
When you
Mm.
look at his attitude toward women, the way
Mhm.
that he created a women's sangha,
Mhm. Mhm.
based on the realization women have the same potential to wake up as men, which today, of
Mhm.
course, we take for granted. But
Mhm.
2,400 years ago in Iron Age India, that was a pretty
Mhm.
big thing.
Mhm.
Also, when
Mhm.
you join the Sangha, you lose caste.
Mhm.
So there's a strong, I think, sort of anti caste, anti discrimination, you could say anti racism built
Mhm.
into that. But in order for the tradition to survive through the centuries,
Mhm.
as I mentioned earlier, it came to this accommodation with the state that kind of
Mhm.
lost its radical edge.
Mhm.
Um, you're completely right that I think, unfortunately, because Buddhism in Asia came to emphasize personal
Mhm.
transformation only, when it
Mhm.
comes to Western societies, especially say the U.S., which is
Mhm.
already
Mhm.
incredibly individualistic, right?
Yes.
Maybe the
Yeah.
most in world history, it kind of plugs into that all too
Mhm.
nicely, and it's easy.
Mhm.
Then there's still a lot of Buddhist practitioners who say,
Mhm.
leave me alone. I just want to work on my own enlightenment, my own peace of mind.
Mhm.
And so Buddhism can, and you know sometimes often does, reinforce
Mhm.
that individualism, but in a way that's really ironic given the
Mhm.
Buddhist critique of the separate self,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
uh, I think in order to really, well, let me say it this way. When we come to Buddhist practice, I think it's almost always because there's some problem in our own lives. Something
Mhm.
isn't quite right. There's some
Mhm.
dissatisfaction. And so we're hoping
Mhm.
for, some healing.
Mhm.
And so inevitably at the beginning, there's some self preoccupation. It's just kind of
Mhm.
built into what attracts us to
Mhm.
Buddhism. But as we practice and we get more deeply into it, what we really begin to realize, if it's going well, is that at the core of our dissatisfaction is this delusion of a separate self.
Mhm.
And so as that begins to dawn on us, I think it naturally leads to a kind of openness, a shift
Mhm.
from
Mhm.
self preoccupation, what's in it for
Mhm.
me, a shift
Mhm.
from that
Mhm.
to, hey, I'm interdependent, I'm connected, I'm a part of everyone.
Mhm.
Um, what can I do to make this a better world for
Mhm.
all of us?
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
that's a kind of a natural shift, and in the Buddhist tradition, that's mentioned
Mhm.
as the Bodhisattva path.
Mhm.
Now, often the Bodhisattva path has been understood as a kind of self-sacrifice. Enlightened people
Mhm.
choose to stick around and help the rest of us. But actually, I think that's a big misunderstanding. The Bodhisattva path is essential to our own transformation. That
Mhm.
you know, uh, as we begin to wake up and realize we've got to
Mhm.
transform our usual
Mhm.
self-oriented, self-preoccupied, or even narcissistic habits.
Mhm.
And so the engagement in the world means that the person who benefits the most when I'm engaged socially for social transformation is me,
Mm.
because that is transforming me, you see. And I
Mhm.
think this is where um, you were asking before, or you were mentioning how Buddhism can transform, or how it needs to
Mhm.
transform, or you were asking about that. I really think
Mhm.
this is the kind of ground zero for where Buddhism has to shift now. Every time Buddhism has gone to a new culture, it's
Mhm.
it's transformed itself. It doesn't just impose itself,
Mhm.
but it interacts with
Mhm.
local traditions. And I think now that Buddhism comes to the modern world,
Mhm.
the most radical transformation, the most radical challenge ever, I think that Buddhism really has to wake up to the kinds of ecological and social challenges we face now. And so
Mhm.
we have to shift more to the emphasis on this kind
Mhm.
of engagement.
Mhm.
Noam Chomsky, one of my intellectual heroes,
Mhm.
recently said in an interview that this is the most dangerous time in human history. And I think he's
Mhm.
right. That and because it's so dangerous, any tradition, spiritual or otherwise, that doesn't engage with that
Mhm.
danger, it's not doing its job. If
Mhm.
Buddhism or Buddhists can't engage with what's happening now, ecologically and socially, then really Buddhism isn't what the world needs. But
Mhm.
there is so much in the tradition here that I think that can help us do it.
Mm. Yeah, I like the term called cruel optimism. It's a term coined by Laurent Berland, the late American philosopher, and
Hmm.
it's when the tool becomes the obstacle, because rather than focusing on the tool as being a means to what we are hoping to achieve, we focus only on this tool, and that's why it becomes our obstacle, and that's why it becomes cruel, because at first it was very optimistic, it was something supposed to help us, and now it prevents us from getting there.
Hmm.
So on the topic of the current crisis, and I think we can call it by its name. So it's the ecological, that, or well, one of the
Hmm.
crisis. So the ecological crisis, is it a spiritual or psychological crisis, David? Do you believe?
You're throwing me a soft plum here, right?
Why not? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy that you're using the word ecological crisis, because
Mm-hmm.
at least in this country, people still talk about climate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Climate crisis or global
Mm-hmm.
warming. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the first thing to say is just to remind ourselves that that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
That, right? Of course, we have to do
Yeah.
everything we can to address the warming, or the
Mm-hmm.
carbon emissions and so forth, for sure. We have to transform as quickly as we can to renewable sources of
Mm-hmm.
energy. But we also need to realize that the ecological crisis is just this tip of the iceberg that includes much more. If you think about
Mm-hmm.
loss of biodiversity, the fact
Mm-hmm.
that so many species are disappearing, so many forests cut
Mm-hmm.
down, uh, toxic pollutants in the air, in the seas, in the
Mm-hmm.
earth, in our bodies, and
Mm-hmm.
so forth.
The constant growth.
Yes,
Now
yeah,
we often mention the need to focus on degrowth and
so
different models of economy. Mm-hmm.
exactly. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
putting all that together, it highlights the fact that
Mm-hmm.
we shouldn't think by simply shifting to renewable sources of energy that we're going
Mm-hmm.
to solve the problem. It's bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think it really goes back to
Mm-hmm.
is the dualism, the sense
Mm-hmm.
of separation that we as a species
Mhm.
especially with our modern civilization, our sense of separation from the rest of the
Mhm.
earth. At
Mhm.
some level, we think that, we're special, we're so different. The earth is simply there as a source of raw
Mhm.
materials or as a dump for us,
Mhm.
and uh, it has no meaning
Mhm.
in and of itself, except insofar as it works for our own benefit. And so
Mhm.
that's the sense in which I think it's a spiritual crisis. It
Mhm.
really comes down to our fundamental species relationship to the earth and the
Mhm.
realization that we need to overcome
Mhm.
that sense of duality. And let me just make the one more crucial point here.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's a profound parallel here between what Buddhism has always said about our individual
Mhm.
predicament, right? That at the core of our delusion and suffering is this sense of a self that's separate from other people. Well,
Mhm.
when you look at the ecological crisis, isn't it exactly the same problem, uh, written large, a
Mhm.
macrocosmic view? It's still the same problem in the sense of the delusion of the separation, the delusion
Mhm.
that our well-being is separate
Mhm.
from the well-being of others. And once we see that parallel, I think
Mhm.
it becomes more evident, doesn't it, that it is a spiritual crisis.
Because that's the lack of compassion. Because compassion is the realization that we are, in fact, not separated. That we're all interconnected.
You
This first of all, what's ecodharma? So the title of your book,
Mhm.
and what can Buddhists teach us about the social, societal, or ecological crisis? Because we've touched on that previously.
Mhm, mhm.
Hmm.
Okay. Yes. Well, it's interesting that the notion of ecodharma,
Hmm.
people sometimes use the term eco-Buddhism. This is still
Hmm.
a fairly new term, still a fairly new development, and
Hmm.
basically what it means, I think, is
Hmm.
something that we are
Hmm.
collectively working out here. But,
Hmm.
but the basic point is the concern to apply traditional Buddhist teachings
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
the ecological crisis. And
Hmm.
that works in a couple different ways. One
Hmm.
one of them um, is to understand how, in a way, our problem today is quite unique in that I think those three poisons that I mentioned earlier, greed, ego,
Hmm.
delusion, in the modern world, I think it's important for us to see that they have become institutionalized.
Hmm.
So it's not simply that,
Hmm.
like traditionally Buddhism would emphasize, say, work on my own greed, my own
Hmm.
ego, my own delusion of a separate self.
Hmm.
And uh, that's what Buddhism is always focused on. But now,
Hmm.
frankly, I think they have taken on a life of their own in the sense that
Hmm.
um, if greed means you never have enough, I think
Hmm.
that's a pretty good description of our economic system.
Hmm.
You mentioned degrowth. The whole problem
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
you know corporate consumer
Hmm.
capitalism in its present form is
Hmm.
that it needs to keep growing.
Hmm.
It's not going to collapse. More profit, more market share, more higher stock prices,
Mm.
and so
Yeah, it never ends.
exactly,
It's like
never enough.
a it's like a hungry ghost, using the
Mm,
the Buddhist metaphor.
exactly,
So
exactly.
mm,
And one
mhm,
way to highlight that is to ask, why is more and more always better if it
mhm,
can never be enough?
mhm,
So I
mhm,
think we need to realize that institutionally,
mhm,
uh, what this means is sort of the greed has taken on a life of
mhm,
its own. I guess I already said that.
mhm,
And I think you can also see comparable problems,
mhm,
institutionalized ill will. You think of the militarism,
mhm,
all the money that the U.S. in particular spends on its military.
mhm,
And sadly,
mhm,
if you spend that much money on your military, you're going to have to use it once in a while, right? And so
mhm,
we have a pretty bad record of imposing our will
mhm,
on other countries, lots of bombing and so forth. Um,
mhm.
and then institutionalized delusion. Well, I'm speaking to you from the country of Fox News and Donald Trump
Oh,
and
all of that.
yeah,
Yes.
all of that. And
Mm,
I think the kind of political crisis we face in this country, where there's this
mhm,
growing polarization, can be
mhm,
directly attributed in good part,
Mhm.
not completely, but
Mhm.
in good part, to the kind of
Mhm.
delusions that the media are
Mhm.
spouting. Um,
Mhm.
so the challenge of ecodharma and the challenge of
Mhm.
socially engaged Buddhism generally today is,
Mhm.
you know, to become aware of these as sources
Mhm.
of dukkha, right?
Mhm.
Not dukkha isn't just my own mind, my own life, but seeing how dukkha has now
Mhm.
taken social forms. And so that
Mhm.
means we have to come together in order
Mhm.
to work to challenge those and to
Mhm.
try to make changes. Yeah.
So, do you think that Buddhists should be more radical? And I appreciate the word radical because it's about going to the roots.
To the root, right.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So
the
it's
Latin, radix, right.
yes.
The radix.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think that, frankly, Buddhism does imply a
Mm-hmm.
radically different perspective on what's
Mm-hmm.
going on now, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
on the individual side, the emphasis
Mm-hmm.
has always been on transforming my greed into generosity,
Mm-hmm.
my ill
Mm-hmm.
will into loving kindness, my delusion of separate self into the wisdom of interdependence. Well, we need to do the same thing collectively, socially, institutionally. We need to
Mm-hmm.
transform our economy, which is so, like,
Mm-hmm.
the US in particular is so incredibly wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we have one of the very greatest problems, maybe the greatest in the
Mm-hmm.
developed world, with poverty. This
Mm-hmm.
incredible and still growing gap
Mm-hmm.
between rich and poor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's not generosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to reform how we police, how our military
Mm-hmm.
works,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to find better ways to educate people so that we appreciate better our interdependence. So all of those things
Mm-hmm.
are radical and absolutely necessary, I would say.
So is ecodharma the fall essentially an extension to this concept of interconnectedness? Because also ecological also means systemic.
That's right.
So it's
Yeah.
not only about the ecology, nature, but how everything is interconnected.
Exactly. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
ecology is a Buddhist
Mm-hmm.
principle, really, because
Mm-hmm.
both are emphasizing interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
That really, we we tend to think of the world as a collection of separate things, and
Mm,
we ourselves are some of those things. But from both
mhm,
an ecological and a Buddhist perspective,
mhm,
the world is really a confluence of
mm,
interdependent processes, which are
mhm.
constantly transforming. That applies to our own lives, and that
Mhm.
applies to the larger um, ecological situation as well.
So, what are the main or some of the main Buddhist or dharmic principles or even tools? Although I don't like the term, to address not only the climate change, because as we've already
Mm.
mentioned, it's something much bigger than that. So the ecological
Mhm.
crisis. So
Mhm.
how to begin?
That's a
Mm,
great question. Well,
mm,
I mean, one answer to that is to give you some
mhm,
sense of what an ecological and an ecodharma retreat is like, right? I
mhm,
mentioned
mhm,
earlier, I'm one of the founders of this ecodharma center uh, in the mountains above
mhm,
Boulder, and I think
mhm,
we've come up with a kind of retreat that really speaks to that. Um,
mhm,
what's nice is we have a what is it? 280 acres of beautiful
mhm,
natural land up there.
mhm,
And so
mhm.
when we have a retreat, we're outside as much as possible, right? I mean,
Mm.
it's very different from the usual sitting in a room and meditating and
Yes.
going inside. What we
Mhm,
emphasize to people from the beginning is instead of sort of retreating into yourself and counting your breath
mhm,
or something like that,
mhm,
open up to the
mhm,
natural world and
mhm,
be open to all the sensations, be
mhm,
open to what that has to speak to you,
mhm,
has to
mhm,
say to you, uh, and then after a day of that we follow up with an emphasis on gratitude practice.
Mm.
which,
So why is that important, David? This gratitude practice, if you don't mind saying a few words about that.
sure. Well, because actually so much of our culture today is emphasizing just the opposite, right? I mean,
Mm,
consumerism,
mm,
which I
mhm,
would argue is the predominant religion of our era,
mhm,
right? I
mm,
mean, if if uh, if a religion is what teaches us what's important and how to live, well,
mhm,
let's be honest, more and more
mhm,
in terms of
mhm,
daily life, I think consumerism is
mhm,
filling that role. But the whole
mhm,
point of consumerism is, guess what? You don't have enough. You need more, and
mhm,
all the
mhm,
advertising reinforces that. It's always the next
mhm,
thing you buy that's going to make you happy.
mhm,
And so a
mhm,
gratitude practice is actually really radical, to be grateful,
mhm,
to for what we have. And there's a couple of quotations that I just love that I think really nail it. One of them is by the great Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, who said,
mhm,
if the only prayer that you ever say is thank you, that's
mhm,
enough.
mhm, mhm,
Wow, that's that's the kind of prayer, that's the kind of transformative
mhm,
practice. And then the other
mhm,
one is by a Christian father whose name I can't remember right now, but he also said, um, "We are not grateful because we are happy. We are
mhm,
happy because we are grateful."
mhm.
So to cultivate gratitude transforms us. And,
Yeah, so I see it as a practice of let's call it the growth. So I don't
mm,
have to be growing constantly
mm,
or collecting, whatever this may be. Buddhist practices, psychological practices, shoes and relationships,
mm,
etc. Yeah. So I can just stop, and appreciate
mm.
what I already not only have, but what is present in front of me, around me.
Yeah, and I think that's really
Mm-hmm.
radical, to be grateful
Mm-hmm.
for what we are, not for what we.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see how that relates to this
Mm-hmm.
sense of lack that we
Mm-hmm.
were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a way of cutting through and letting go of the sense of
Mm-hmm.
lack, and
Mm-hmm.
feeling completed by
Mm-hmm.
appreciating what
Mm-hmm.
we are, what we have right here
Mm-hmm.
and now. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. So
and then
any art. Mm-hmm.
well, let me
Sorry,
go
yes,
ahead and
go.
just finish this retreat.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's after those two practices um, that then we do something really radical. Uh, in that, at this point, the people on the retreat have been living together 24/7 for 2 or 3 days, and then
Mm-hmm.
we gather and we have a session where we share our feelings about what's happening ecologically,
Mm-hmm.
which, as you would imagine, emphasizes a lot of grief.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling our grief, sharing our
Mm-hmm.
fear, our anger, our
Mm-hmm.
confusion about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is so important because I think, for so many of us, we have this grief, but we repress it. We're
Mm-hmm.
afraid to feel it. We're afraid it'll it'll be too
Mm-hmm.
strong, and
Mm-hmm.
we'll be overwhelmed by it. But the act of sharing our grief is
Mm-hmm.
essential for um, it's like other people expressing it gives us the freedom to express our own. It motivates us to do that, and it's really
Mm-hmm.
transformative. People
Mm-hmm.
people feel empowered by doing that,
Mm-hmm.
and also it really helps to distinguish grief from despair. Right?
Mm.
See,
That's
from the Buddhist
very
standpoint,
important. Mm.
yeah, despair, like hope, can become a
Mm.
kind of a head trip about the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Um, but grief is something we can feel right here and now. And grief, you could say, is
Mm.
the other side of our love. I
Mm.
once saw a
Mm.
memorial in downtown London, which it was a memorial to the victims of 9/11. There were many British people there as well in the Twin Towers.
Mm.
And the memorial simply said, grief is the price we pay for love.
Mm.
Grief
So
is the
when we
only
laugh,
we pay. Yeah, grief is a
when
sign of what we
mhm.
love. Yeah.
when we laugh, we experience pain. There's no other way. If something is important, I don't remember who said it. There will be pain
Mm.
because it is important.
And it's important that we be open to that pain, because if we're not, we're going to
Mhm.
be repressing our love as well.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so uh, by sharing our grief,
Mhm.
that's feeling our grief, it's
Mhm.
in a way it can be very kind of liberating. And then
Mhm.
the last thing, or the main, no, not the last thing, but it right after we have that sharing experience, we do some prep, and then people go off by themselves.
Mhm.
We're in beautiful natural setting, so
Mhm.
people go off for a solo 2 days and
Mhm.
2 nights by themselves, not talking to anybody else, but
Mhm.
just relating to the trees, the
Mhm.
flowers, the stream, the
Mhm.
mountain, the rocks by themselves. And
Mhm.
we encourage people, don't
Mhm.
have an agenda, just be open
Mhm.
to what the natural
Mhm.
world has to say to
Mhm.
you. And people find that very powerful as well and very transformative. And then they come back and share what they've been going
Mhm.
through. So I offer that sort of as an example of a kind of
Mhm.
ecodharma retreat. Not the only one,
Mhm.
of course, but
Mhm.
not the only one possible, but an example of an ecodharma retreat that I think that can help address our
Mhm.
alienation, our separation from the
Mhm.
natural world. And people do seem to
Mhm.
find it very powerful and often very transformative.
Mhm. So, David, if you don't mind me asking this slightly or maybe very personal question, why ecodharma? Why are you so invested in this specific topic and not on what follows its activities?
Hmm. Well, yeah, I maybe I can say something about my own personal shift here, because
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's only me. I think this is something that happens to a lot of people, that as we do something like Buddhist practice, and of course it doesn't have to be Buddhist practice, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness can function in this way as well. But as we do the practice and sort of see through the delusion of separation
Mm-hmm.
and open up more,
Mm-hmm.
open up to the world, maybe I can quote Dogen here, one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorites. He talked about how Buddhist practice is about forgetting the self, letting go of the self.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, he said, you realize your intimacy with the 10,000 things. After his own
Mm-hmm.
awakening, he emphasized, I came to realize clearly that mind is nothing other than rivers and mountains and trees, the sun and the moon and the stars. And if we realize that, well, then, naturally it's like getting away from our own self preoccupation, our own
Mm-hmm.
ego,
Mm-hmm.
instead of always asking, what's in it for me? What can I get out of this situation? As we let go of that and we just
Mm,
open up, I
mm,
think there's kind of a natural shift. What do we have when we open up, especially
mm,
today, right?
mm,
Today, given the ecological crisis, which is so
mhm,
powerful and so threatening to all of us, when we open up to the world and what's happening to the world, I think that calls on us.
mm,
We feel called
mhm.
to respond in whatever way we can.
And that has been your experience as well? Is that what you're saying, David?
Oh, for sure, yeah, and for
Mhm,
many of the people who come to our
mhm,
eco-drama retreats, this is, it's
mhm,
still early days. I would say that
mhm,
eco-dharma, um, more and more people, more and more Buddhist
mhm,
practitioners are feeling pulled
mhm,
in this direction. But I would
mhm,
say it's still a movement that's just beginning. The other thing worth mentioning,
mhm,
Julia, is
mhm,
in addition to addressing Buddhist practitioners and
mhm,
encouraging them to be more ecologically engaged,
mhm,
we're also concerned at the Eco Dharma Center to speak to activists,
mm,
ecological and other social activists, because as we know, that's a really tough
mhm,
path, right? And
mhm,
it's really hard not to become burned out or frustrated.
mhm,
Um, and
mhm,
so it's so important if one can sort of ground one's activism
mhm,
in some kind of a contemplative practice. And this is the really
mhm,
essential point, I think, that the kind of
mm,
practice we need today is twofold. We continue to
mhm,
work on our own personal transformation with meditation and
mhm,
such, but we also realize we need to be engaged in the world and how those two
mhm.
practices depend on each other, reinforce each other, help each other.
So it's quite different from the narrative that often is quoted that Buddhism is about being disengaged,
Mhm.
that about solely focusing on what is internally happening, and
Mhm.
that's it. But I think that's what we call meditation sickness, this inertia,
Mhm.
or
Well,
this is the result of such a practice,
right.
but going back to ecodharma and your book, you also mention the loss of the sacred. So what do you mean by the loss of the sacred, and why do you think why do you think that this may be still important to today, David?
Mhm. Well, that's another way of talking about our sense of separation, and particular our sense of alienation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when you go far back into history and you look at, uh, say, hunting gathering societies, for
Mm-hmm.
them the natural world is sacred. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
they That's how they experience it. They're directly, you know, connected with it, relating to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how once we get agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
then we
Mm-hmm.
separate ourselves off. We're not dependent on the fruit and the nuts and the berries and such in the same
Mm-hmm.
way. Uh, we we try to defend our fields. They're separate from the forest, and
Mm-hmm.
we're defending them against the wild animals. So
Mm-hmm.
there's the beginning of a separation, and this also applies to our religions. I think one of the unfortunate things that's happened is, religion came to be about qualifying for um,
Mm-hmm.
a better world after we die, right? If we believe
Mm-hmm.
what we're told that we should believe, and if we do
Mm-hmm.
what we're supposed to do, what we're told to do,
Mm-hmm.
then there's a good chance that after we die, we might go to somewhere like heaven
Mm-hmm.
and have an eternity
Mm-hmm.
with God there, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's
Mm-hmm.
this kind of
Mm-hmm.
dualism, and what that
Mm-hmm.
tends to do is to sort of project the sacred elsewhere, higher, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it also
Mm-hmm.
tends to devalue this world, because this world right here and now is just a means to qualify for that higher reality. And so
Mm-hmm.
by treating this world as a means, and it's the same thing economically, right? We treat the world as
Mm-hmm.
a means, something to be exploited, something to be used.
Mm-hmm.
It's not our home anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we uh, religiously we're trying to escape it, and
Mm-hmm.
economically we're trying to manipulate and use it. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, when we do that, the sacrality of the earth, the sacredness, is lost.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Have you, and any point, and in the context of Buddhism, this may not be the right word, but using it as a sort of a shortcut, lost your faith, David, in Buddhism and all these practices and principles, or in other words, what helps you maintain yourself on this path, um, being engaged, being a socially engaged Buddhist, or simply a human being?
Hmm. Well, when you talk about losing faith,
Mm,
it's interesting um, how to say it. Um, I'm reminded of something Joseph Campbell said. He was a scholar of
mm-hmm,
mythology.
mm-hmm,
He said
mm-hmm,
a lot of the problems happen because people uh, misunderstand the teachings. The teachings
mm-hmm,
are metaphorical; they are symbolic, but
mm.
we take them
Yeah,
literally, right? And I
that's the
think a really
problem.
good
Yes,
example of that
yes,
is
yeah.
transcendence, right? What we were talking about
Ah,
before.
Mm-hmm.
the way religions talk about transcendence, hey, let's go to heaven after we die.
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism, too, is talking about transcendence, but what we need to transcend is not this world, it's our usual way of experiencing the world. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a different way to experience it, which is
Mm-hmm.
what meditation can help us experience, help us realize.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, for me, when I think about faith in a tradition, it's you know, it's not simply accepting on face value everything that Buddhism, traditional Buddhism, has taught, or any other religion.
Mm-hmm.
But what we really need is this conversation, this dialogue
Mm-hmm.
between
Mm-hmm.
these traditions, such as Buddhism and the modern world. And by the way, that point
Mm-hmm.
about transcendence. Hey, if we go
Mm-hmm.
back to the New Testament, the Gospels, Jesus himself
Mm-hmm.
says, all right,
Mm-hmm.
the kingdom of God won't come in such a way that you can say, oh, there it is, or here it is, because the kingdom
Mm-hmm.
of God is within you. The kingdom of God is among you, right here and now, you see. So
Mm-hmm.
my understanding is that with this kind of interrogation, what we are doing is kind of recuperating or
Mm-hmm.
um, making the religion a lot more alive, more fresh, and more
Mm-hmm.
relevant to the modern world. And so I'm constantly inspired by Buddhism and other traditions, but I'm also
Mm-hmm.
constantly engaged in this dialogue of
Mm-hmm.
asking what's really genuine here and
Mm-hmm.
what is being maybe misunderstood or misinterpreted.
So this evaluation, in a way, is the thing that helps you maintain this, well, optimism or engagement or whatever you'd like to call it, prefer to call it. Mhm.
Right. Well, this is a really, I mean, I
Mhm.
quoted Noam Chomsky about what a dangerous time it
Mhm.
is. That
Mhm.
means it's also an incredibly exciting time too. I
Mhm.
mean,
Mhm.
uh,
Mhm.
I mean, in one way, it's a wonderful time to be alive in
Mhm.
that there are all these things happening that sort of push us, require us to be
Mhm.
as awake as possible. And
Mhm.
one of the wonderful ways that Buddhism helps us deal with the dangerous situation is the way that the Buddha emphasized non-attachment to results, right?
Mhm.
If you go back to the original teachings as we have them in the Pali Canon, the Buddha
Mhm.
emphasizes that the actions of an awakened
Mhm.
person are nidasa, which can be
Mhm.
translated without
Mhm.
attachment, without expectation.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this is where the meditation comes in. Our task
Mhm.
today, our challenge is to do the very best we can. We don't
Mhm.
know if what we do is going to make any difference whatsoever. We can't know
Mhm.
that, but that's okay. And because we
Mhm.
are grounded or rooted in the kind of contemplative
Mhm.
practice, it gives us that grounding in the here and now, right here, right
Mhm.
now. My task is to do the very
Mhm.
best I can. What's going to come of that? I don't know, but that's okay.
Mhm.
That's all I can
So
do. That's what I'm called upon to do. Yeah.
I think that's a very a good definition of what unattachment is, because there are
Mm.
many misconceptions. That we're
Oh,
actually less invested and
oh.
not as engaged, and that in fact we shouldn't be that engaged. I don't care.
Right, right.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm,
exactly. Yeah, thank you for bringing that out. I think that's really
mhm,
important. It doesn't mean
mhm,
not doing the very best we can. We're challenged. We're
mhm,
called upon to do that, and to think strategically.
mhm,
Try to bring results. But ultimately, too,
mhm,
we're rooted in the practice where we can let go.
mhm. Mm. So maybe one last question, David, if you don't mind, being
Sure.
aware of the time. So, what are your hopes for ecodharma? Its future and the future activities, how it can influence maybe not only the dharmic scene or Buddhist scene, whatever that may be,
Mhm.
but other disciplines, other areas of our human
Right.
activities.
Well, that's a great question, given that
Mm-hmm.
ecodharma is still a very new
Mm-hmm.
concept and something that's just beginning. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I really think is important is to emphasize the connection with other social problems, social issues. Um, and this was already happening to some degree. For
Mm-hmm.
example, uh, it's no accident that it's people in poor countries, or in the U.S. Here in the U.S., it's poor people, it's people of
Mm-hmm.
color that tend to be suffering more from
Mm-hmm.
ecological uh,
Mm-hmm.
problem,
Yeah.
pollution, and so forth. So, in other words,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to develop the connections between ecodharma and anti-racism work, but
Mm-hmm.
also class analysis. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
I I just find it so astonishing that in this country we have so many poor people, and we're also creating so many more billionaires. I mean, there's something so wrong there, and
Mm-hmm.
so we have to bring all these things together and show the linkage, that the kind of
Mm-hmm.
transformation that we have to be working toward is going to have
Mm-hmm.
to involve all of those, right? I mean, if you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
there's a number of problems that can be seen to have the same fundamental root, where you
Mm-hmm.
have one people oppressing another people. You can
Mm-hmm.
see that with
Mm-hmm.
racism. You can see that with class. You can see that
Mm-hmm.
you can see that with the ecological crisis, humans over
Mm-hmm.
the rest of the earth. You
Mm-hmm.
can see it with
Mm-hmm.
men and women,
Mm-hmm.
male oppression of women, and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. And they're not all exactly the
Mm-hmm.
same problem, but they're very much related. And I think what
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism can help us
Mm-hmm.
understand is how all of those cause dukkha, and how today the kind of Buddhism that we need is going to help us. That it really it it, it I want to say it requires us, but it's calling
Mm-hmm.
on us to respond as well as we can, um, to these deeper challenges. And that also
Mm-hmm.
requires creating stronger sanghas, communities. Because
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism has emphasized so much the individual transformation, I think we really haven't done enough as far as building stronger
Mm-hmm.
communities of people, which are
Mm-hmm.
exactly what's necessary in order to address,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
institutionalized media will, delusion,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. So uh, I'm hoping that ecodharma will continue to grow, will continue to move in that direction, and that it will become more and more apparent to people as our
Mm-hmm.
present crisis deepens, that this is not a distraction from Buddhist practice. Maybe that's the most
Mm-hmm.
important thing, that the
That is
engagement,
the practice.
it is an essential part of the practice.
Mm-hmm.
It,
Mm-hmm.
it's an essential part of our own transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is happening, and I think it will continue to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of,
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing what
So
I
we
can.
should base we should actually Buddhists should maybe facilitate us understanding this awareness
Mm,
that this neoliberal thinking, that everything depends on me. Well, I'm responsible of many things. I
mm,
am in control of many things. Many
mm,
things are my responsibility. But maybe it is a relief that actually many things depend on so many other factors
mm.
and people, and that we do not live in a void, that we are all interconnected. So going back to the to
Right.
the to the basic principle ideas and concepts of not only Buddhism, but I guess current day science.
And I think it's especially important, say, looking at American Buddhism, which is what I'm
Mm-hmm.
most familiar with. Until
Mm-hmm.
pretty recently, it's mainly white and middle class, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's so important for those of us who are white,
Mm-hmm.
middle class, to um, to become fully aware of our privilege,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
and to use that
Mm-hmm.
privilege in the sense of doing what we can. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in in
Mm-hmm.
in response to, again, what Chomsky calls the most dangerous time in human history.
But our privilege is also requires responsibility. To have a
Right.
privilege, it is to be responsible.
Exactly.
Mm,
it's an
mm,
opportunity. Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. So thank you so much, David, for agreeing to do this. I still have so many conversations, but I'm looking forward to. I've said it now out loud. I'm looking forward to our future conversations,
Mm,
but being aware of the time, just wanted to once again thank you, and hoping to continue this and other conversations
mm,
in the near future. And good luck to us, I should say,
mm, mm,
in terms of developing, proliferating not only the ideas but the activities of. Let's call it ecodharma, but we know
mm,
that it's not only to do with Buddhism. I
mm.
think it's much bigger than that again.
So, and well, thank you, Julia, for this invitation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about this. Could I also put in a couple of quick plugs? Our Ecodharma
Mhm.
Center has a website where you can find out more
Mhm.
about Ecodharma. That is rmerc.org, Rocky Mountain
Mhm.
Ecodharma Retreat Center.org. And if listeners are interested in the sort of thing that I've been talking about, there's also a lot more on my own website,
Mhm.
davidloy.org.
Yes, and of course we do recommend the latest book that David has written, Eco Dharma, so Buddhist teachings for the ecological crisis. So again, thank you so much, David, and thank you to our listeners, and have a good life.
Thank you, Julia.